Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 42 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the New Jersey Devils and won by a score of 3-2. The Sharks continue their perfect record here in 2025, 2-0 in the new year, and on top of that, managed to also complete the season series sweep of the Devils as they had also won their first matchup this year. That was a 1-0 shutout victory thanks to Mackenzie Blackwood, former Devils goaltender, completely standing on his head. The Sharks had no business really being in that game, but Blackwood carried them over the finish line. Here tonight, the effort from San Jose was significantly better. You could argue about which of these two teams were the better team here tonight, but I'd say it was relatively even, maybe slightly in favor of the New Jersey Devils at times, especially in that third period. But the Sharks, they hung around with a team that is significantly better than them. The Devils, while they have been losing a little bit as of late, are one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference, and the Sharks gave them a very good fight. It's actually quite interesting because it was just a couple of games ago when I was discussing that lifeless loss to the Philadelphia Flyers, and I was talking about why Warsofsky would have even tried to have Georgiev play that game. I had mentioned that with these three next matchups coming up for the Sharks, Tampa, New Jersey, and Vegas, that those were going to be extremely difficult games for San Jose to win, and yet now they have already started out by beating two of those teams. Perhaps I underestimated the type of impact that Yaroslav Askarov would have in those games, even against the top clubs in the NHL. Now, when it comes to the start of this first period, even though the Sharks actually played a generally strong defensive game, it didn't really start out that way. The first few minutes, many of these types of turnovers that we are used to seeing from the San Jose Sharks, you're kind of watching this one and rolling your eyes a little bit that it might end up being one of those types of games. But luckily for San Jose is that the Devils also were not sharp to start this one. They were making many defensive errors themselves, and it is not something we are used to seeing from New Jersey, who is actually one of the better defensive teams in the entire league. So it was a trade of chances through the first few minutes. Both goaltenders really had to be ready to go in this game and making those huge saves, and it was only San Jose would actually find the back of the net in the first period. That one would come from Nikolai Kovalenko, his fifth of the season, but his first as a San Jose Shark, and it is a 1-0 lead for San Jose going into the second. In that middle frame, this time it is only New Jersey who manages to strike. That one comes from their captain, Nico Hischier, on the power play. Something of note about the Devils' power play, they really schooled the San Jose Sharks here tonight on how to work this one around. They only had, I believe, about a power play and a half here tonight, and they managed to get this goal. The Sharks, on the other hand, had 4 power plays for themselves. Only one of them, the one that actually came a few minutes after this power play goal given up, was actually good. The other 3, including 2 in the first period, were just terrible. The Sharks tried a new look on their power play here tonight. They had Will Smith playing on the top unit with Celebrini, Granlund, Wenberg, and Toffoli, so still a 5-forward unit, and it just continues to just not really look all that great. It's not a tight unit. You see what New Jersey is doing. The moment you try to pressure them, they're instantly passing the puck to somebody else because they have 2 or 3 options open at all time, so that causes the penalty killers, the Sharks in this case, to have to kind of collapse more so to the middle and then hope that they're going to be able to block these passes. It gives the Devils way too many options to work with, and that's how they eventually end up finding this goal to Nico Hischier. Compare that to the Sharks. There's just a little bit too much of this slow playing. There's not enough movement happening, and so the Devils can pressure players on the Sharks power play, and it causes San Jose to be the one having to chase after the puck constantly in the offensive zone, and eventually the Devils are able to clear it out, and it kills off a ton of time. So we only got to see one decent power play from San Jose here tonight. Meanwhile, the Devils, they make use of the few chances they did have. In the third period, this one starts off actually quite early on with a Sharks goal. Macklin Celebrini makes it 2-1 for the Sharks, his 13th of the year, which gives him the rookie goal-scoring lead in the entire NHL. Of course, we are used to the fact of Sharks having third-period leads as of late over pretty much a good chunk of the month of December, but frequently they have let these ones go away from them. The other night against the Tampa Bay Lightning, they cleaned that up and they closed that one out. Here tonight, it got a little bit close because, of course, Paul Cotter would end up tying this one up, but when just about 30 seconds left in the game, it is Cody Ceci, his third of the season, makes it 3-2 with a little bit of help from the referees. So we have seen at times the officiating has not been great in previous Sharks games this season, and while this is not like a penalty call or anything like that, sometimes the bounces do end up going your way, and this one just barely slips out of the glove of Jacob Markstrom, and that ends up giving the Sharks the late game winner, something that they are usually on the other side of, and they finish this one off 3-2 victory. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the reuniting of the Lund line. This was kept apart, not for any actual reasons, but simply because Eklund has been injured these last few games, and he makes his return to the lineup. And there was a little bit of a worry that we might not get a great game from Eklund, simply because he has been out for a couple of weeks now. And on top of that, this is an afternoon game, so sometimes maybe you're not fully ready to start. But it was very much the opposite for Eklund. He was not only really playing a good game, he was probably the Sharks' best player on the ice, at least one of their best players. Eklund was skating hard, he was making things happen, he had that great pass, the primary assist on the Kovalenko goal, but it was not just that, playing with a ton of speed through the neutral zone, managing to get behind the Devils' defense. As I mentioned, while the first period, at the first few minutes, it was shaky for New Jersey, as they cleaned things up in both the second and the third, there weren't really a lot of openings for San Jose to work with. That's where the chances really started to shrink away, but this first line was able to find those openings, and the big thing was definitely Eklund bringing that energy to this team, something that they were very sorely lacking a couple of games ago against the Flyers. And Eklund is really just that type of unique player, because sometimes, not unique because there's a few players like this in the NHL, but something you don't get every day, because there are certain players that have the high level of talent. Look at someone like a Will Smith, right? He has the capability of making crazy plays that very few players in the NHL are able to do, or at least he will at some point within the next couple of years. The talent is definitely there. And then of course you also have more energy type of guys, someone like a Luke Cunnin who's playing with that speed, who's getting involved, who's getting into those board battles, but maybe doesn't quite have that same level of high-end talent. Eklund is able to put the best of both worlds here together by being not only a high-end talent player who would be even a good second liner on some of the most competitive teams in the NHL currently, but also being a strong energy guy who's willing to work along the boards, who's willing to get involved there, be a little bit of a pest on the ice, not quite at a Kachuk level necessarily, but still be someone who can get under people's skins. And that's why he's still such a pivotal piece of the San Jose Sharks moving forward, and why they maybe looked a little bit lifeless at times when he was out of the lineup. When it comes to the other two players here, we have Granlund and Zetterlund, and while there was a lot of hype going with Eklund, these two players were definitely no slouches either in this game. Mikael Granlund has slowly trying to kind of work his way back up to that top level of game that he had back at the beginning of the season. I think during that losing streak, and I talked about this multiple times, he got some tough matchups against guys like McDavid and McKinnon, and so they were frequently hemmed into their own defensive zone. Here tonight, it was expected that we might see a similar thing, because the Devils do have a lot of high-end talent. Hughes, Bratt, Meyer, former San Jose Shark there, but Granlund actually did manage to play a really strong game here. Doesn't get on the scoreboard, but still I felt as though he was a pivotal piece of this Lund line, so you gotta give him credit there. And then when it comes to Fabian Zetterlund, he is at time, I call him kind of the weaker link of this Sharks top line. Both Granlund and Eklund really skating hard. Zetterlund just doesn't quite have that capability to keep up, but that was not the case here tonight. Perhaps a little bit of extra juice in his game playing against his former team, the New Jersey Devils. He looked really on the same page as you usually expect, but also at that same level of talent from both Eklund and Granlund. And so while this wasn't a crazy game for this line, it's not as though every single time they stepped on the ice, it's shift after shift of offensive zone time and great chance. Against a team like the Devils that isn't really going to usually give you a lot to work with, they were just about as good as one would think. So by far the Sharks' best line on the night for sure. Then we get to Graf, Celebrini, and Smith, the kid line, the rookie line, the NCAA line, whatever you might want to call them. And it was actually not a great look for this second line, very rarely actually managing to do much of anything. Sure, we see that Celebrini goal early in the third period, and then there was a great chance from Will Smith late in the second, but besides those two looks, this second line rarely actually got anything going. And that is sort of against the fact that Warsofsky tried to play them in very favorable spots. They got many of these offensive zone shifts to try and get possession of it, work it around the offensive zone, and make the Devils pay, but it very rarely worked out. They were either losing the faceoff on a pretty consistent basis here tonight. Celebrini struggled in that area against the Devils, or even if they did manage to win the faceoff, it would usually not amount to much. And so, especially when you consider the fact that previously, when it was Celebrini, Smith, and Zetterlund together, they were frequently the Sharks' best line on the ice, you do have to look a little bit at Colin Graf's inclusion here. Now this, I don't want to pin everything on Graf. It's not as though Graf is the reason that this second line didn't do much. Both Celebrini and Smith did not have their best games of the season here, but it is something to say that without perhaps someone like Zetterlund creating a little bit of space on the ice, even if he couldn't quite keep up with the skill, this line is struggling a little bit more. So with Colin Graf, he did have the great assist. I'll give him that. It was a very nice secondary assist picked up on the Celebrini goal. So certainly wasn't a bad game for Graf. I thought it was relatively solid like it was the other night against Tampa. But when you're playing with Celebrini and Smith, you want better than just relatively solid. You want someone who can really elevate the type of talent that finds themselves on this trio. And so I don't really think Graf is quite there yet. Maybe he could be with a few more games, but it does also need to be said that with Eklund returning to the lineup, somebody did have to come out, and that somebody ended up being Nico Sturm, who we saw block a shot in last game against the Tampa Bay Lightning. He was a game-time decision for tonight. He does not end up dressing, and so Graf keeps his spot in the lineup. But when Sturm does come back and the Sharks forward group is more healthy, Graf is likely the odd man out, I would say, primarily because he is waiver exempt, but also the other possible options. Kovalenko scored here tonight. Kostin, I thought, was pretty good. I'll get to both of those players a little bit later. And we know Barclay Goodrow is never getting a healthy scratch, so Graf is probably that guy. So it is likely that we'll end up being forced to see a different look, and it will be interesting to see who Warsofsky does decide to try in that particular area. When it comes to the two other players, again, I don't want to just fully focus on Graf not being able to do much, because I didn't think this was a great game for either Celebrini or Smith. It was nice to see Celebrini actually manage to score here, right? That's obviously a great thing, and I mentioned he becomes the rookie goal-scoring leader, but in terms of actually managing to open up some opportunities for himself this game, probably one of his weaker ones of the season. Defensively, I don't think he was terrible. He was actually, I guess, pretty good, honestly, but maybe a little bit of a quiet game for Celebrini. And then when it comes to Will Smith, very, very similar things to be said about him compared to his two line mates here tonight. One thing that I will once again mention, going to be sounding a little bit like a broken record here, is that Smith, the high-end talent is there. I actually mentioned that earlier when discussing William Eklund, but you do want to see him be able to be a little bit stronger. It's not something that's going to improve this season, but it'll be maybe a year or two down the line, because there was a play actually right as soon as the Sharks scored this Celebrini goal. I believe they came out right away for the very next shift on the ice. And we see the puck get into the offensive zone. Smith has possession, but he doesn't actually have the support with him, so he doesn't have a great first pass to make. This is where you would want Smith to be able to hold on to the puck a little bit longer, allow for his teammates to catch up, and then manage to maintain possession in the offensive zone. But instead, he is just very easily separated from the puck due to the physicality and strength of the Devils defenseman, and then the possession is right back in the Devils' favor, and they get a chance up the ice. So it's not necessarily a huge knock against Smith, because it's not entirely his fault that he just simply doesn't have the strength to keep up currently in the NHL, but it is definitely something to keep an eye on as we move forward, not just in games but in years, to hopefully see Smith improve in that area. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Kostin with Wenberg and Toffoli. Now this third line was really, really quite something to begin this game. When the Devils were having their issues defensively, this third line was the one really jumping at that and creating the chances. In particular, it was of course Tyler Toffoli, who had probably a good 3 or 4 grade A chances just in the first period of this game, either getting robbed by Markstrom, where we saw Toffoli laughing about it after, how he could not possibly end up burying on that one, but also hitting posts as well. He was just barely kept off the board against his former team as well. As this game did go on, however, once, as I mentioned, the Devils did tighten up defensively, this third line started to not really find as many chances as they would have liked. And just as I mentioned the previous game with Smith making that mistake on the Nick Paul great chance in the third period, I have to say the same thing about Tyler Toffoli here after Andre Palat, with about 3 minutes to go in the third period, gets his own great chance and seemingly an open net to shoot at that, but he ends up sending him more so towards Askarov, who makes that big save. Toffoli should have been covering Palat in this situation. That is his man. And in the case where, you look at Will Smith and you say, okay, it's maybe a little bit more understandable being that young player, Toffoli being that veteran who has the confidence from the coaching staff to be on the ice in the last 3 minutes, that's an assignment that you definitely don't want to be missing. So great start to the game for Tyler Toffoli. It didn't finish off all that well, but still mostly positive for him. His two line mates I'll go with on the other side first. Klim Kostin, kind of a middling performance, I would say, from Kostin. More so, I would say, at the same level as the one in the previous game against Tampa Bay, where I think there were some positives to take out, especially in that first period when there was that space to work with. I thought he managed to use it pretty well. I would have, however, enjoyed it more if during the second and third periods, when suddenly things tightened up a little bit, if Kostin could still find those openings for himself. He was just struggling to actually do so, and so it wasn't a great game for Kostin. And when it comes to Alex Wenberg, Wenberg. I thought there were some good things from an offensive perspective. Yes, the referee does help him in this Cody Ceci goal that ends up being the game winner, but it also is Wenberg sticking with the puck here, sticking with his man, and then able to get that puck up to Cody Ceci, so some credit still has to go towards him. There were some awkward defensive moments for Wenberg in this game, which is not a usual sense from him, but all in all, I don't think he was too bad. And so this third line, it was a great start, maybe not the best finish. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, because Sturm is injured, Cunnin moves to center. He is still joined by Goodrow, and we have Kovalenko take up this spot on the fourth line. And Kovalenko, I thought, played with a lot of energy here tonight. That was something that was very important to see because he has been relatively quiet as of late. I've talked about this a ton. Even when he is getting the occasional chance here or there, it still doesn't feel as though there's a lot of oomph in his game. Here tonight, however, he had a few shifts where he's willing to throw his body around, be physical, and then this goal that he scored was extremely impressive. Maybe not quite at the level of a Tyler Toffoli one, but he has to get this puck from behind him. The pass is behind him. He uses his skate. He kicks it to his stick. He has to go to the back and then the forehand, and he beats Markstrom, who's a really great goaltender, cleanly. That was a really nice goal for Kovalenko. Hopefully helps him build up some confidence. I mentioned that if Sturm does return to the lineup, he will obviously take back this spot on the fourth line. I imagine Cunnin will move to his wing. Goodrow will remain there. Kovalenko could be a very good option for that second line slot with Celebrini and Smith because he is creating that space and still does have a good amount of talent to go with them. That would probably be the trio that I'd like to see, perhaps as soon as next game if Sturm is indeed healthy. Then we have Cunnin and Goodrow. Cunnin, I did like here tonight. He had a great keep-in on the Kovalenko goal. Usually when it comes to, because he picks up the secondary assist here, usually when it comes to secondary assists, people kind of devalue them a little bit because you're mostly looking at the primary guy who is the one who has to make the play originally. It's the secondary side, the secondary assist guy is usually kind of riding the coattails, but sometimes that third player to touch the puck is very important. That is indeed the role that Cunnin does fill in here with a great keep-in at the blue line to get this one down to William Eklund. So you like to see that there. There were other brief moments in which Cunnin was able to make an impact from an offensive standpoint. I thought defensively as a whole, this fourth line wasn't the best. When they were stuck in their own zone, they were really stuck in their own zone, but it didn't happen a ton, so I'm not too upset about it. Barclay Goodrow is definitely the odd man out on this fourth line because I liked Kovalenko's energy and he scores that goal. Cunnin made a couple of nice plays. Goodrow himself, nice plays were not really there, and so there was mostly just the defensive issues that occasionally occurred. There was some physicality, there were some hits that he managed to toss out. He ran over a guy in the third period, if I'm not mistaken, in the neutral zone, but otherwise not exactly a very exciting outing for him. Then defensively, we have these Sharks 6 players here. Still no Jake Wallman in the lineup, and yet the defensive effort was yet again quite solid. And it starts out the top here with Thrun and Ceci. Thrun, I think, did have some shakier moments here tonight, especially early parts in that first period. Actually, both him and Ceci made a couple of those early mistakes, I will point out. But as the game wore on, he definitely settled in, and Thrun actually ended up playing a pretty good outing. Cody Ceci, I thought, was even better than Henry Thrun, however. Not just because he scores this goal that ends up being the game winner, but I thought he was very active, he was very involved, and it was not an easy situation to be put into as per usual, facing off against not just skill guys like Hughes and Bratt, but these guys also have a ton of speed in their game, and that's something that you can easily criticize about Ceci, is that he can't really keep up necessarily with some of the high-level speed in the NHL. So positionally, he had to be really good this game, and I thought maybe not really good, but he was pretty good at the very least. So a solid outing for the Sharks' first defensive pairing. Ferraro and Liljegren also, I believe, did start this game a little bit shaky, but ended up cleaning things up as it went on. Liljegren, still, we're not getting much offense from him. I think he had maybe one decent play offensively, but defensively, I thought both of these guys were certainly not too terrible. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we do once again have Vlasic and Ruda. So for a second straight game, Vlasic is in. It's not that much of a surprise because he was actually quite good in the previous one against Tampa Bay. People will look at this Devils goal in the third period from Cotter, and they might put some blame onto Marc-Edouard Vlasic. I actually don't hate what ends up happening here. Sure, obviously, you would like Vlasic to have been able to get this puck off the stick, but it's not really a situation in which Vlasic simply doesn't have the speed to keep up with Cotter and he gets just beat wide, and that is the great opening. It is more so a situation where Vlasic actually has the right idea. He goes for the poke check here. He just simply misses. And of course, you could criticize him for missing, but it's a situation where perhaps, 9 times out of 10, he is able to separate the puck from the stick, and it just doesn't end up working out here. And he keeps him wide enough that I think maybe Askarov probably wants this goal back in this particular situation. Otherwise, eliminating this Paul Cotter goal, I actually thought Vlasic was again very remarkably solid, and I imagine he manages to maintain his lineup spot here for the Sharks moving forward. Again, it does beg the question of what happens if Jake Wallman is healthy enough to go on Tuesday, because if Vlasic continues to play well as he has, and Thrun was quite decent here tonight on top of that, who is actually going to be stepping out of the lineup? That's a decision that Warsofsky is going to have to think long and hard about for sure. And then we have the goaltender Yaroslav Askarov. As I mentioned earlier on, perhaps I underestimated the type of impact that Askarov is able to have on these games. He lets in just 1 goal against the highest scoring team in the NHL, the Tampa Bay Lightning, just 2 days ago. He lets in only 2 goals against one of the higher scoring teams in the NHL, the New Jersey Devils, as well. There has been a ton of talent that Askarov has stood tall against. Hughes had some great looks. Bratt had some great looks. Meyer had a couple of good chances as well, and yet Askarov was there every single time. It was yet again not one in which he has to completely stonewall the Devils. Like if we compare this to the performance of Mackenzie Blackwood in the Sharks' first matchup against New Jersey this season, it's not quite at the same level. But again, if it was not Askarov in net and it was Georgiev, this is probably a game that the Sharks lose like 4-3, maybe even 5-3. Askarov, very big impact for San Jose, and it will continue to be interesting to see what the goaltending situation continues to be here for Warsofsky for the San Jose Sharks. Because if San Jose were truly like going for a playoff spot, a playoff team, you would obviously ride Askarov until you have like your next back-to-back, or at least until he proves as though he can't be played anymore. But since the Sharks are not a playoff team and they're not actually trying to get high up into the standings, going into the next game on Tuesday against Vegas, perhaps we do see Georgiev get another look in between the pipes, and that might spell disaster for San Jose. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, like I said, on Tuesday. They'll be facing off against Vegas. In the 2 previous matchups against Vegas this season, the Sharks gave up a combined 13 goals. One of them was an empty netter, but still 13 goals. That's 6.5 goals per game. Not a great look. The Sharks will obviously look to bring that down. If Georgiev is in nets, they'll probably struggle to do so. If Askarov, however, maybe the Sharks can get themselves on a 3-game winning streak. Class dismissed.